Welcome back to the Shepherd's Pie, a slice of hope to raise faithful kids. I'm Tony Kolank, a law school professor, a homeschooling columnist, and the author of the Harwood Mysteries fiction series for teens. By the way, my third Lucy short story in that series is actually going to be coming out in a book by Catholic Teen Books called Ashes, releasing this Lent, so keep an eye out for that. On today's show, we'll be discussing how to stem the rising tide of atheism in our youth, and my guest is apologist and speaker, Brian Mercier. My guest today is Brian Mercier, the president of the organization Catholic Truth. He's a professional speaker, a retreat leader, an author, and an apologist. For more than 20 years, Brian has talked about a host of topics on retreats, parish missions, conferences. He's spoken at colleges, universities, on TV and radio, including EWTN. And he's also the author of the books, Why Do You Believe in God? And Counterfeit Spirituality. Brian, welcome to the Shepherd's Pie.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
You have done a lot of really cool things, including being president of this group and going around and talking to people about God. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into this business and what is it in your background that led you there?
Nobody would probably know by looking at me today, but I used to dress in all black and I used to carry weapons and I used to hate the world. And I had a lot of anger. I had a lot of depression. I basically lived in anger and depression for many, many years throughout high school and college. And even though my parents brought me up Catholic, I was brought to church every Sunday. I went to confession once a month or so, but I still did crazy things. I still hated the world. I still was super depressed all the time, even though I said a rosary every day, felt like God wasn't answering my prayers. And I did a lot of some bad things. And my mom was concerned about me. So she decided to send me out to a Catholic college to get some more God in my life. And so she sent me out to Franciscan University of Steubenville, where I spent 3 years after a 2-year college in Massachusetts. I went out there, and that's really where God changed my life, because previous to that, I believed in God. If you had asked me, do you believe in God? I'd say yes, because I was brought up to believe in God. But did he answer my prayers? No. Did I feel like he loved me? No. Did I feel like he was really in my life? No. Did I know who he was? No. I just felt like I was tossing up prayers to this empty space, and which I think a lot of young people can kind of sympathize with. And so it was out at Steubenville that I had the St. Paul style conversion, you might say. I got knocked off my horse in a very extreme, powerful way, very powerful conversion, and ended up transforming it inside and out, upside down and backwards. God just took out all of the hate within my life and filled me with great love. He took out all the confusion. He took everything and just filled me with an overflowing, bubbly happiness that I've had ever since, really. That was over 20 years ago. He put a fire in my heart. I walked out into it was a sports fields, but they have this 150-foot cross out in the sports fields, and it's overlooking the town of Steubenville. And I remember just sitting in the middle of the field and crying. And I just said, God, you've helped me so much. You've literally transformed my life. I just want to help people the way you've helped me. I want to heal people the way you've healed me. And I want to bring transformation into people's lives the way you've transformed mine. And I really believe that's what he's allowed me to do in little ways and maybe in greater ways than that. And it's what I've wanted to do for my whole life. And it's kind of what I do now. And it took different forms, because when I was young and out of college, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I started out, my very first job was youth ministry, and I did that for a while. I ran a youth group and I was the pastoral associate and that sort of thing. And then I eventually evolved into substitute teaching, which was fine because I could talk to students, always stay relevant to what kids are into, what they're struggling with, and that sort of thing. Get back more into youth ministry, got into teaching religion. I was eventually a director of religious education for one of the biggest parishes in our archdiocese. I think we had 1,200 kids and 100 teachers. It was enormous. I also started speaking at confirmation retreats. I started giving my testimony of how God changed my life. And eventually, I just started running retreats and started doing a lot of retreats. Sometimes I have 3 or 4 a week. And then I got into parish missions. I got into speaking at conferences and many other avenues as well. About 3 years ago, I decided to amplify that message times 100, and I started Catholic Truth. Then we've reached millions of people in over 60 countries just through our YouTube channel. I would say in a nutshell, that's how it all came about.
Wow, that sounds like an amazing story. I thought you were going to start your conversation saying, my parents sent me to college and that's where I lost my faith, which is where most people go.
Yes.
But once you went to Steubenville, I was like, oh, okay, he's going to find his faith. So let's segue to this then. It seems to me that we send our kids to Catholic high schools and colleges, and instead of them coming out with faith, a lot of them come out without faith and having lost their faith. What are you seeing as you go out and survey the landscape of high schoolers and college students? What are you seeing with their challenges to faith?
It comes down to three things. Number one, kids have a lot of good questions today, and they're not being answered, not proficiently. And many times we've just bypassed them. And in fact, this was the same thing, especially in my day growing up. I used to ask my parents, how do we know that God exists? How do we know that God's out there? Or if God loves us, then why does he send people to hell? I remember one day I said, Mom, why doesn't God answer our prayers? And my mom and dad said, oh, he does answer them. And I said, well, mine haven't been answered. And my dad said, don't say that. They've been answered. I said, actually, they haven't. He's like, I said, don't say that. And it's like you weren't allowed to question God. Does that help your faith? No, it squashes it. Kids have good questions. They see a puzzle full of pieces that's all over the table. They see some of it together, but they can't make sense of it because the pieces aren't in place. And it's our job to answer those questions well. And if we do our job and we do that, then the kids will have this aha moment, this enlightening moment where they say, oh, I get it. My faith makes sense. In Catholic schools and in public schools, I have talked to hundreds, probably thousands of teens just about everything you can imagine. And even in public schools, kids would say to me, Mr. Mercier, if I knew all of this before, I never would have left my faith. Or if someone had explained it to me the way you did, I never would have walked away, or I would have come back sooner. What you're saying makes sense. So when you help these kids to understand their faith, it makes sense to them and they don't want to leave. And in fact, they're more willing to live it. But a lot of times we just say, oh, you have to have faith, or we don't know the answer to their questions. And so we give like a half answer, when in reality, I think one of the biggest problems today is kids aren't understanding their faith. And that's why I wrote my book in the first place. Why do you believe in God? Because these are questions I've received thousands of times. And I finally just wrote them all down in a book. It's actually based on real conversations that I've had with teens and adults. So you get to hear both sides. And I actually give many of them out for free at my retreats so kids can actually get answers to their questions. So that's one prong of the problem. The second one is that we've done a miserable job of passing on the faith over the last 50 years, especially since the sexual rebellion days, and anarchy and just the New Age movement and a lot of problems in the church in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Parents slowly stopped passing on the faith, slowly stopped going to church. We were told that we could just follow our consciences. And so we stopped listening to the church. And so we have generations of people who have not passed on the faith to their teens. Religious education is good, but it's not supposed to be a replacement for passing on your faith to your kids. So many parents have said, I'm coming back to the faith, but I can't explain it to my kids. Can you help me? So I'm starting to try to design something that will give parents the ammunition they need to know it themselves and also to explain it to others. So we're not living by example in many cases. We're not passing it on in many ways. And the kids aren't getting their questions answered. The third thing is that we haven't really taught people in general how to pray on a deep level over the last 50 years, in my opinion. In some ways, yes, but I can probably count on maybe 2 fingers how many times I've ever heard a homily at church on how to pray, how to overcome your objections, how to connect with God through prayer. What does God sound like? How do you hear his voice? How do you know when he's speaking? These are things that kids really struggle with because what happens? They pray and they pray and they pray and they just don't feel God, or they don't get their prayers answered, or their grandmother dies and they pray that the grandmother wouldn't die. So they feel like either number one, God's not real. Number two, he is real, but he doesn't care. I gave a retreat in New Jersey. Yeah, and after the retreat, 7 girls came up to me, good girls, like high school girls who really live their faith. And we sat in a circle in the church, and each one by one, just peppered me with deep, heart-wrenching questions that they were struggling with that no one really answered for them. Every single one of these girls was crying their eyes out like a bad makeup cry. And they were all just, why did my grandmother die? Why won't God love me? I'm struggling with this. And so I answered all their questions, and they were all hugging each other by the end, and just, they got it. They understood it. But our kids are being neglected. If you think about how many hours of video games and Netflix they play and watch, and then how much we actually pray and cultivate a relationship with Jesus. And we wonder why God doesn't answer our prayers. We wonder why we don't feel close to him. We wonder why God doesn't feel real in our life. It's because it's what I put into high school. Nothing. I, at Catholic Truth, really try to not only help people to know God spiritually and develop a spiritual life, but to really know, understand, and live their faith with purpose and passion.
You've indicated that there are questions that kids are asking that they're not getting good answers to, and that maybe you've been able to give them some satisfactory answers. So could you maybe preview for us maybe 2 or 3 of the most impactful questions that you're getting from teens, and the answers that maybe a parent or a youth minister might want to have to some of those questions?
So I don't want to shamelessly self-plug my own book, but I really, really do highly recommend it because they give the biggest questions that teens have. And some of those big questions are like, how do we know that God is real? I mean, how do we know that Jesus really walked the earth? How do we know the Bible's true? I usually respond by asking a lot of questions to teens just to make them think, kind of how Jesus answered questions by asking questions. They'll say, someone probably just made up the Bible. And I'll just say, oh, who was it? And they'll immediately say, wait, what? I'll say, who made up the Bible? They're like, oh, well, I don't know. Then how do you know someone made it up? Well, I don't, and then they're more open to, understanding the faith if you challenge them like that. Or if someone says, I don't believe in God, I don't think he exists. Okay, well, why doesn't he exist? Why don't you believe in God? And if God doesn't exist, how do you think we got here in the first place? How did everything come about if God doesn't exist? And so this starts to make them think. But a lot of the kids have questions like moral questions, like especially regarding homosexuality or, something like that. And they're good questions. And these are what kids really struggle with today. What about transgender people? Like what if someone really thinks they're a man or a woman? Like they're not trying to be defiant. These are concerns that they actually have. They have friends who struggle with these things. And so I really try to help them to understand the church's teachings in a super compassionate way as well that really makes sense to them.
So one technique that you're saying is to challenge them, ask the question back. But let's even try that with your question about why doesn't God answer prayers? You go to your parents and you're like, Mom and Dad, why doesn't God answer any of my prayers? I suppose you say to them, well, why don't you think he's answering your prayers or something? Like, what are you supposed to do with that question as a parent? And do you give them an answer at some point, or do you just try to question them so they can think themselves?
A little bit of everything. I mean, I think it's situational, depending on how old the kid is and that sort of thing. But in general, I like your question. Exactly. Like, why don't you think God's answering your prayers? Like if we don't, any kind of evangelization to youth or adults, anybody in general, if we don't know where they're coming from first, we don't understand where they're coming from, we're never going to be able to really answer their question. Like if someone says, oh, I don't like the Catholic Church. Why? Oh, well, the Crusades, the Inquisition, you had 3 popes at one time, and they're listing off all these things, but none of these things are actually their problems when you get down to it. So yeah, why don't you believe that God is answering your prayers? What are you praying for that you don't think he's answering? Oh, well, I'm asking God to help my parents not get divorced, but they keep seeming to not like each other, fight more, and they're going more and more toward divorce. And I said, okay. Or they might say, oh, I don't want my grandmother to die, and I pray to, so it depends on the situation. But then I say, okay, well, there's certain things. See, God doesn't control every single thing on this earth. We have to understand that. Sometimes, it comes down to having free will. God wants your parents to be together as much as you do. And he might even be trying to help them. But he's given us this thing called free will, where he allows us to make our own choices. He wants us to listen to him, but the reality is sometimes we don't. And he's not going to grab them by their shirt and shake them and say, hey, you have to listen to me. So sometimes people have to, I guess, make mistakes, or they do things that God doesn't want to do. So we can keep praying, but it doesn't always mean that God's going to answer the questions or that he can even interfere with their free will. And I tell them the story about how I prayed for that for years with my parents, but they ended up getting divorced anyways. But I didn't give up faith like so many kids do. I kept praying, and all of my brothers and sisters kept praying. And 7 years later, my parents got back together. And it's because we all kept our faith. We all prayed. We prayed like you wouldn't believe. And they got back together. They've been happier than ever. They go pray the rosary together like you would never even know they're the same two people. But most people, when they get their prayers unanswered, they just stop praying or they lose faith. And God doesn't always answer our prayers right away, but over time, in his way, he can answer it. Even if he doesn't answer it, he can be there for us in our pain and help us with what we're struggling with. So, off the top of my head, that might be something, that I say.
I mean, a lot of the questions that you're talking about do involve social issues. That seems to be almost the rock that is being used to crush, Christianity is, well, basically you don't want people to love each other. How do you handle those kinds of questions when you get the LGBT type of a question?
Those are really, really tough questions. They're of the toughest because mostly they're emotional. And so it's really hard to deal with them. But first thing is they have a lot of misconceptions. They don't always understand what the church teaches and why. They just feel like, oh, well, God wants us to be miserable. The second thing is, I try to stick up for people and treat equality. I say the Pope has actually written documents where it says we're supposed to treat everyone the same. And even people who struggle with homosexuality, we're not supposed to bully them or put them down or treat them differently. Or let's say I'm talking to someone who struggles with homosexuality. I'll say the thing is, you say you're gay, but you're not. You're human. That's what you are. You're making your identity your sexuality, but you're so much more than your sexuality. I don't go around and say, hi, I'm Brian, I'm French. But people come up to me all the time and say, hi, my name's John, I'm gay. I'm like, no, you're not. You're John. You're a son of God, and you're a beloved child of God. You may happen to have an orientation that's homosexual, but that's not who you are. That doesn't define who you are. See, if you define yourself as a son of God, you're going to live one way and feel one way. But if you define yourself by your sexuality, you're going to live a whole different way and define yourself a whole different way. So I really try to start out with the foundation there first.
Yeah. So going back even to just the basic question, does God exist? I'm assuming that some of the feedback you might get from teens is something like, well, basically we know now that everything is like evolution or, science, and we're learning more and more. Where is the evidence that God exists? I mean, what do you do with that kind of a question?
Well, this is where parents really need to step it up and watch YouTube videos, listen to podcasts, start reading books. If you have children and they're asking hard questions, you need to be studying and looking up these things so you can give them good answers or point them in the right direction to where these good answers are. I can answer these questions all day left and right, but parents mostly can't just because we haven't been taught to. Religious education gives usually the basics, but they don't really give the deeper Thomas Aquinas proofs for how do we know God exists. But I generally say that we believe in God because of order and design. Order and design. I say, just a simple example. If you're walking down the beach and you see a big heart drawn into the sand and it says, Johnny loves Sally, XOXOXO, I say, do you believe that the waves made that? And they said, no, of course not. And I said, then what happened? They said, two people came up and drew that, probably people who loved each other. And I said, exactly. Two intelligent human beings drew that in the sand. And we knew that because we can recognize the patterns, the letters, and the intelligence behind it. We know that it's not just an accident where the waves came up and left English words in a heart. That doesn't happen. And so I said, it's likewise when you look at the universe and you see infinite amount of universes and universal constants and forces. We don't think that just all happened one day by nothing, from nothing, because of nothing, or for no reason whatsoever, or it was just all there. No, we say there's a higher intelligence behind that, and we recognize the intelligence in the order and the patterns and the perfection of the universe.
I really like that answer too, because I think it is something everybody can relate to. What about the concern like, well, you say there's a God, but I don't feel that he exists. I have zero feeling of God in my life, no matter how much I try. So therefore, he must not exist.
Yeah, and that's good. And I would see this is different for every person, but I say, what's your prayer life like? The majority of kids said they don't even pray daily, usually weekly. They might say a Hail Mary before they go to bed. And I try to say, imagine if I went to bed every night. I didn't talk to my wife the entire day, but at night I read her a 15-second poem and then I go to sleep. I was like, is that going to foster or cultivate a relationship with her? The answer is no. I said, so the little you put into the relationship with God, the little you're going to get out, or nothing at all. But the more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. So I would recommend stop praying for a couple minutes. And this is for adults too. If you're trying to do the work of God without God, then you can't fully do the work of God, or at least not as successfully. We have to have good prayer lives too. And I've just know so many youth ministers who are so busy. They say, I don't have time to pray. And I said, that's what Mother Teresa said too, till she did a holy hour. And then she realized she didn't have time not to pray because she has the souls of kids and people in her hands. And so I asked the kids, what is your prayer life like? Because if you don't have a prayer life, then you really can't know God. Second, do you have any blocks in your life? I sometimes think of a skit like a wife who wants to love her husband, but she's kind of has a couple husbands on the side. She's talking to them and, they're really good looking and she's not really going too far with them, but she just likes being around them all the time. She spends all her time with them and they're funny. And well, if you're hanging out with other people like that, you're not going to really foster a good relationship with your husband because other things are inhibiting that. Now, I'm just making an example, but take those 3 or 4 husbands that she's with and put on their foreheads a postcard that says Netflix, video games, movies, social media, and you're spending all your time with these things and you're wondering why you can't get close to God because that is your God. That's what you're fostering relationships with. And so kids who say, I don't feel God. Well, I try to diagnose the problem and get them on a spiritual routine. Let's get you on a 20-minute prayer time a day. If you can't pray for 20 minutes in a row, pray for 10 minutes in the morning and 10 minutes at night and start there. Maybe read a chapter of the Bible a day because that is going to teach you about who God is. You can't love somebody you don't know. So in order to get to know Jesus, you need to read the Gospels. You need to read about his miracles, how much he loves you, how he rose from the dead, how he can do everything. And the more you know Jesus, the more you're going to know that he's working in your life. And soon you're going to hear him start speaking to you through these words as well. So maybe the rosary. So I try to give them different patterns of life as well as curbing some of their habits, not getting rid of the things they do, but just curbing them so they can make more room in their hearts for God. That would just be a very quick answer.
One other one that I'm thinking about as you're talking is the reality is that the kids and adults, all of us maybe, have this problem sometimes, is they just don't want to take the time. They don't want to bother. It's too much work. It's too much effort. And they don't see the point. Because you're right. I mean, if they spent, 2 hours in front of the Blessed Sacrament or something, it might very well change their lives. But
if I can interject there for a second, I end all of my retreats with an hour of adoration. And the kids usually say it's the most powerful part of the retreat. They say they experienced God or they just feel peace or they felt his presence. Or some of the kids are up there, teens in front of their own peers are bawling their eyes out in front of the Eucharist. Some of them have their hands up. Like, it's just amazing how kids open up their minds to God. And I said, you know why you experienced God? Because you gave him time. When was the last time you gave God an hour in your life? And they're like, never. Maybe at church, but I didn't pay attention. And I said, exactly. You gave God good, unadulterated, uncompetitive time where you're not competing with anyone or anything else. So that's important. And that's why you experienced God. And if you do this more, imagine how much more you're going to experience him.
So if you're talking to parents or teachers and they're like, yeah, but how do I motivate kids to be able to take that first step with God so they might have that experience? Like, how do they do that?
Teach them first how to pray. Tons of kids say they want to follow God. Teenagers, college kids are telling me they want to follow God, but don't have the slightest idea of how to pray. That's a problem. If they don't even know that they can just share their day with God or take time to thank God for the blessings in their life. Take time to pray to God. Take time to sit in silence for 1 minute before you even start praying. Just sit in silence and try to put yourself in the presence of God and realize he's around you and then pray to him, not just this guy in the sky. That's a start. Reading the Bible is huge. Praying the rosary is huge, or Divine Mercy Chaplet. Maybe the Liturgy of the Hours where you can pray the scriptures and these things things speak to you. But all of these things, you try different ones and you see which one, really speaks to you, which one you can pray out of love for God. But if you can't start with just 10 minutes here and 10 minutes there, it's never going to work out at all. Same thing with parents. Parents say, oh, I have such a hard time praying. I have a hard time making time to pray. Like I think Mother Teresa once said, if you don't have time to pray, or if you're too busy to pray, then you're just too busy. Like I once said that to my best friend. He's like, Brian, you don't have time for a girlfriend. He's like, you're never going to get married. I was like, yeah, you're right. I don't have time for a girlfriend. I travel the country. I speak. I write books. I write tracks. I make videos. I don't have time for a girlfriend. 3 weeks later, I met my would-be wife. And it was, it's amazing how much time I found that I didn't know I had because I just wanted to spend time with this beautiful girl. And all of this time just came up. And I always say that if we love someone, we will make time for them. The real issue is we don't love God, and we've made all of these other gods and idols in our life, and they take us away from God. And we need to reprioritize the time we spend in our life. And once we start reprioritizing and making time for God, even little bits, 30 seconds here and there while we're at a traffic light, even in the shower, while we're walking home from school, while we're walking home or waiting to pick our husband up from work, there's 100 times throughout the day where we could just take 30 seconds to 2 minutes to think about God, to praise him, to thank him, instead of picking up our phone and scrolling, which is our always natural reaction. These will really help us to start cultivating a relationship with God better.
So as you mentioned, because, there's never enough time to be able to even touch the tip of this iceberg, but it sounds like you've, put some of the iceberg into this book. So if people want to get a hold of your book or learn more about you and your materials, where would you want them to go?
Well, they can check out our website at Catholic Truth. Just type in Catholic Truth on the web, or Catholic Truth YouTube, Catholic Truth Podcast, Catholic Truth Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, or anything else. You can find our books on there. You can also find our books on Amazon as well. You can follow us on any of these platforms. If you want us to come speak at your church, you can follow us on our website, which is thecatholictruth.org. And that's kind of our just platform to find everything else as well.
Brian, it has been amazing having you on the show. I need to have you on the show another time because I can tell there's so many things that we could be talking about that you reach kids with, but it's just been a pleasure having you on today.
Thank you. Yeah, I would love to. We just scratched the surface, and I never even got back to the Catholic schools and what I saw when I was a teacher. So maybe another time.
That could be our next episode. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for the show today. We've been speaking with Brian Mercier about stemming the tide of atheism in our kids. Again, this is Anthony Brown-Kolenc. If you have a question for me or a topic you want me to cover on the show, please drop me a line on my website at anthonykolenc.com. You can also learn more about my series, The Harwood Mysteries, there. Until next time, may God bless you and your families as we work together to raise faithful kids.